Welcome, folks. As you know, we'll be beginning any minute. We're delighted to welcome everyone to EVN's 2019 annual conference. Please find your seats immediately. Thank you. Appreciate that. That was quick. I'm Poorvi Vora, and this is Liz Howard, my co-chair. She works at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I work at GW. And maybe we will just introduce our main speaker today.
Yes, I will just quickly introduce Greg Miller, who is the co-founder and COO of one of our sponsors today, the OSET Institute. So here's Greg.
So maybe we have a couple extra minutes. So many of you know about EVN, and many of you are newcomers. This is your first experience, so welcome, especially to our new friends. EVN is the country's only professional society of election officials, computer scientists, cybersecurity experts, researchers, and advocates, all of us committed to accurate, accessible, transparent, reliable, and verifiable elections. Though we may disagree very often, our goals are the same. For over 20, that's an understatement. For over 20 years, EVN has addressed the most pressing election security matters facing our country. And this is its annual conference. I'll give the mic now to Greg.
So we're right on time, which is good because we have a tight schedule this morning. Good morning, everybody. This morning, we are privileged to hear from a true champion of election integrity and security, Senator Ron Wyden. The senator and I are both alumni of the University of Oregon, fellow Ducks, and coincidentally, both of us migrated to Oregon from Stanford about a decade apart. Ron for law school, and I as an NCAA transfer athlete. So there you go. My first contact with the senator was 20 years ago, however, when he successfully nominated me to a digital privacy commission under the direction of the FTC when I was at GE's Medical Logic. The Honorable Ron Wyden served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1981 until his election to the Senate in 96. The Senator Wyden believes that the nation's biggest challenges can only be solved by what he calls principled bipartisanship, solutions that allow all parties to reach agreements while staying true to their principles. As ranking member of the Senate Committee on Finance, following that approach has helped him author more than 150 bipartisan bills on issues from health care to tax reform and technology. As one of the Senate's foremost defenders of American civil liberties and rights, he's fought back against government overreach by both Republican and Democratic administrations. And 2 years before the Washington Post revealed the government's mass surveillance program in 2013, Wyden sounded the alarm, warning Americans that our government was abusing the Patriot Act. Then he worked successfully to end that mass surveillance dragnet in 2015. Today, Senator Wyden has emerged as a champion for election integrity, security, and innovation. So this morning, we'll learn more about his work on these issues, which have become matters of national security and defense of democracy. Thus, it's with my privilege to introduce to you my senator from our great state of Oregon, the Honorable Ron Wyden.
Greg, thank you for those very kind words. And you have to keep all these basketball stories a little bit in perspective. I did go to school on a basketball scholarship, and I was dreaming of playing in the NBA, which was a ridiculous proposition because I was too small, and I made up for it by being quite slow. So keep these basketball tales a little bit in perspective. But Greg, we do share these both Oregon roots and interest in these issues. So big thanks. And if you're having trouble waking up, look at his socks. All right. If my mom was here, my mom also worked at Ugly. She was on the Stanford campus as well. If she was here, she'd say I'm running with the right crowd. That all of you are really doing this incredibly hard work with respect to elections, and elections ought to be transparent and accurate and verifiable. And the reality is we're light years away in some parts of the country. I'm not going to get all political, here at 8 o'clock in the morning. But this spectacle of what went on in Georgia is just take your breath away, staggering. You don't have to be for Stacey Abrams the way I am, because I think she would be a terrific governor, terrific public servant, to say what went on there is wrong and what they're still doing as of today in terms of throwing money at machines that don't meet this test is very troubling. And you all have been working on these issues since before they splashed page 1 of the newspaper, and that's why I wanted to come on a busy day. So let's talk for a few minutes about how Congress can start protecting America's fundamental constitutional voting rights and some of the forces that stand in the way. I mean, I just looked, for example, at the voting machine lobby, and early on, when we learned that they were putting remote access software in voting machines and lying to the country, to me, to the New York Times, people asked me what I thought. And, most of what we talk about, and you all are much more knowledgeable than I, is kind of in incomprehensible language. I said, well, let me just boil it down. Putting remote access software in voting machines is about the equivalent of taking American ballot boxes and putting them on the streets of Moscow. Okay? Oh, I get that. So we started digging into these issues several years ago, and it was clear that the threats were much more serious and broader than we thought. We asked the voting machine lobby, which literally thinks they are just above the law. They are accountable to nobody. They've been able to hotwire the political system in certain parts of the country, like we've seen in Georgia. So I asked them some really outlandish questions, like, do you have a chief information security officer? Man, that's smoking hot. That's like incomprehensible. I mean, that's right up there with James Clapper pretending he didn't understand it when I asked him, does the government collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? So we're not asking these folks real complicated questions. It's kind of, pretty basic. And then I went on to ask again, just drilling into such complicated matters like, has your company experienced a data breach or hack? Whew. Hard to breathe when you're faced with such difficult questions. Stonewalling. If they were a law firm, it'd be, voting machines and Stonewall attorneys at law. And ES&S is the worst offender. They're the ones who installed remote access software, and they're the ones who denied what the New York Times said, because the New York Times blew the whistle on them like I did. They actually came to my office because they thought, well, if you send a bunch of powerful people, then senators just do whatever they said. And they asked me what I would like them to do. And I said, I'd like you to support our effort to have hand-marked paper ballots and risk-limiting audits. And by the way, they're still going to get scanned, but, they're going to, be verifiable. We didn't hear from them again. We're now up to 300 customers, apparently, for this remote access software. So we went from nobody to a few systems. Now we're at 300. And William Peter Wyden, my wife and I are older parents. My wife owns the Strand bookstore in New York City. So sometimes I'm referred to as the spouse of the owner of the world-renowned Strand bookstore, and we are older parents. And if William Peter Wyden age 11 was on campus for something like that, he'd say, "Daddy, they're telling you some big whoppers." And that really is the case. The company's been investigated by federal prosecutors in 2009 for using bribes to secure a $50 million contract with New York City. The company also has a well-documented track record of flying state elected officials hither and thither and whining and dining and all the rest. And I just bring this up because I want you to know we're up against some really entrenched, powerful interests who have really just figured out a way to be above the law. There is no other way to characterize it. They have managed to literally be above the law, and what they are doing is coming at the expense of the integrity of the way America votes. I mean, this is not, sort of dead weight, things that don't really count and the like. This has a real, cost. This is coming at the expense of the integrity of how Americans vote. My view is that the maintenance of our constitutional rights should not depend on the sketchy ethics of these well-connected corporations that stonewall the Congress, lie to public officials, and have repeatedly gouged taxpayers, in my view, selling all of this stuff. So we went out on a mission after we had our little set of discussions with the voting machine crowd to find out what the actual cybersecurity experts say ought to be done to ensure the security integrity of votes. And over again, the knowledgeable people in the field said you need hand-marked paper ballots and risk-limiting audits. Full stop, end of sentence. That was the view repeated again and again and again. So last year I introduced the PAVE Act, Protecting American Votes in Elections Act, which required these two propositions: hand-marked paper ballots, which remove a lot of the risk when people cast their ballots, and post-election risk-limiting audits, so you can go in there and figure out what, if anything, has been done with bad guys or people who might have been playing with the system and where there are irregularities and that kind of thing. So we've got a lot of feedback from knowledgeable people, and around the country, the people who say they run elections say they love paper ballots and audits, and they do believe that Congress has got to do more to secure elections. So this morning, I thought I would take the occasion to announce that I am going to be introducing a new, significantly expanded version of the PAVE Act. It will still include paper ballots and risk-limiting audits, but it's going to incorporate a great deal of the feedback that we have heard over the past year. So here's what we're going to propose to see if we can jumpstart an election security moonshot. That's what we're going to call it, an election security moonshot. The bill's going to provide $500 million to states to buy optical scanners to count paper ballots. We're going to get a fairer shake for disabled folks. And we heard a lot from the disabled community. Their votes are just as important as everybody else. So we provide $250 million for states to buy new ballot marking machines to be used specifically by disabled voters to mark paper ballots that are the same size and the same kind of paper as the ballots marked by hand. Under the new PAVE Act, the government will pick up the cost for all post-election risk-limiting audits. What we heard from lots of election officials is they wanted to do risk-limiting audits, but they didn't have the money to pay for them. My bill will end the days when any local or state government has that excuse ever again. Finally, the bill would pay for ballot design and printing for every ballot that meets usability requirements set by the EAC. I don't want any more issues like we saw in the Florida Senate race last year, where the confusing ballot design might have had a really big impact. Second, the bill gives the Department of Homeland Security the power to set mandatory cybersecurity requirements for elections. And as you know, there are now no mandatory standards for voting machines. The EAC sets standards for voting machines, but they are voluntary. All right? Not only are the voluntary cybersecurity standards not working, but it's clear that the EAC is the wrong agency to be in charge of election cybersecurity. The current chair is essentially, in the language of our time, a cybersecurity denier. She dismissed the intelligence community's assessment in January of 2017 that Russia meddled in our election. And just put your arms around that. You have officials of two administrations, okay? Two administrations saying the Russians meddled in our elections. And the current head of the commission, Ms. McCormick, denies that and says, quote, it's propaganda perpetrated on the American public. So you have a chair who's singularly unsuited to the job, and then you get up against the sort of policy question apart from the chair. My view is the Election Assistance Commission was never intended to be a cybersecurity agency. Commissioners weren't chosen for their cybersecurity expertise. The commission doesn't have that kind of cybersecurity expertise. And I can tell you, I'm on the Intelligence Committee. My older child sometimes wants to know, so, Dad, what's going on your so-called Intelligence Committee? It's a dangerous world, folks. I'm not getting into any classified things. I understand the rules, but there are a lot of people out there who do not wish the United States well, unfortunately. So we need good in-house cybersecurity expertise to defend against what are really serious threats. My bill would give an agency that does have the security expertise the power to set minimum security standards for voting machines, election management computers, and other election systems. The Department of Homeland Security has that expertise, and my bill would put Homeland Security in charge of setting those standards. So, if I were you guys, and I'm kind of moving into the home stretch here, I'd be saying, so, this guy from Oregon's come in here and said some stuff that sounds pretty sensible, common sense. We know Russia, Iran, and all kinds of other hackers in unfriendly countries want to mess with American elections. So, excuse me, sir, I don't want to be difficult, but I say if I were you, why hasn't Congress acted? That's what I'd ask. Here are some of the reasons. Some of the status quo crowd says that elections are a states' rights issue. There's some on the far right who even say it would be unconstitutional tyranny for the federal government to set mandatory election cybersecurity standards. Now, that's pretty strong stuff, unconstitutional tyranny. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution says, and I'll just quote, the time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. So it was clear that the founding fathers, who certainly were not contemplating smartphones or Twitter or all kinds of other things, or cybersecurity issues, had pretty good sense of things. So they kind of really spelled it out there. I'm a lawyer by name only. I was running the legal aid program for senior citizens for a lot of years. That's my background, working with older people. But it's pretty clear. Congress has the power to set rules for federal elections. That's what the Founding Fathers said. In the absence of federal election, the states have produced, as I think we would agree, a kind of mixed bag. You got some states doing a quite good job, a number that probably would be considered okay, and some that are colossally bad. Okay? 3 categories. Oregon, California, and Colorado, and I'm completely objective about that first one, are at the cutting edge of election security, embracing innovative best practices like air-gapped election systems, which really means the machines are not connected to the internet. And risk-limiting audits and independent security audits are also there. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum from Oregon is Georgia, with their paperless voting machines running vulnerable software that, interestingly enough, the private sector stopped using in 2010. Microsoft stopped using what Georgia is using, Microsoft stopped using. So I guess that's why you may have 160,000 missing votes in the Georgia lieutenant governor's race. Voters in Georgia have the same constitutional rights to fair elections as voters in Oregon or Colorado. But there are officials like Brian Kemp who see, in effect, insecure elections and what amounts to voter suppression as features that help them win, not serious, fundamental, good government issues that Americans are entitled to have addressed. And I think the federal government must take responsibility for protecting the rights of all Americans by stepping in and mandating basic cyber security. And if there's any question about this kind of still being a very real, allergies or me, somebody's, front rows. The governor hired ES&S's former top lobbyist as his deputy chief of staff. So these guys are everywhere, literally. So that's my solution. I hope it won't be partisan. And, in Oregon, we have over the years had people try to make these issues partisan, and all our reforms come back to being bipartisan because they're just fundamentally good government. Every valid vote, Republican or Democrat, ought to be counted. We ought to say it's the most basic constitutional right because it ensures that government is legitimate. That's what it's doing. That's why it's so important. Rumor has it that there's a 2020 election coming up. I saw Beto O'Rourke got in this morning at 3:30. So it's like 24/7. Really, it's really unbelievable. Not a lot of time left to put secure systems in place before voters go to the polls. And just so you know, and I'm going to give you a charge, this ought to be, when you go out and talk to elected officials, you ought to tell them, this is a 5-alarm issue. And, political change is very rarely top down. It's almost always bottom up. And so what I'm doing is I get about in the hall at home and in Congress and elsewhere is try to make the case that insecure elections are unacceptable. The American people deserve better. And I know that all of you are experts, you have advanced degrees, and you're incredibly knowledgeable. about technical issues that I can only begin to imagine you're spending time on. What I'd like to do is ask today that you be part of this effort to build a grassroots juggernaut here in the next few months for my legislation. We need to have a way to concentrate the energy. There are only 100 senators. Each one of you could take one. I am not laughing. I mean, bodies at rest stay at rest, especially in the United States Congress. You got to come along and give it a push. So I really appreciate the chance, to be with you. That is my humble request, that you help me really start a grassroots juggernaut from sea to shining sea, because this country can move fast when people think there's a real problem. 2020 is coming up, but if the country understands how serious this is, and the bad guys, folks, again, I'm not talking about classified information. They are just like burglars tapping on the windows. They're out there all the time just looking for vulnerabilities. Let's have hand-marked paper ballots, let's have real audits, let's have the additions to the PAVE Act, and with your help, with literally, if this group decides you're going to take one senator each, or maybe you get one and then you want to go to a even bigger challenge, do it. But my sense is we can get this bill done if we can mobilize folks like yourselves who understand so much about it and will be persuasive with senators. Thanks for having me.